Okay, good day, everyone. Good morning, wherever you are. Thank you for being here on our second webinar on the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring protest. We have a great event here with three panelists. So if our panelists can turn on their cameras, please. Thank you. So last week, my colleague, Kelsey Norman from Baker Institute, moderated a panel with Amani Jamal, Sunil John, and Shibli Telhami. That was the first event on our series on the Arab Spring protests on the 10th anniversary of the protests. Today, we're excited to have the second panel on the effects of these protests. At a time when the American political scene is characterized by unprecedented instability and change, it's not a bad time to turn back and look at what the Arab Spring protests have brought to the regional countries, regional dynamics, and what they might imply for American foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa region. While there is a tendency to think about the protests as somewhat limited efforts focused on introducing democratic changes, it has increasingly become clear that the effects of this wave of protests in the Arab world was profound and transformative. What is the impact of these protests on regions' authoritarian regimes? As a result of these protests, are we seeing a wave of democratization or authoritarian entrenchment? Did these regime changes, did these regimes change the way they handle dissent and opposition? What kinds of lessons can we draw as a result of these protests at the domestic level? Another set of questions concerns, did the wave of protests affect regional politics? Are we witnessing the emergence of new alliances in the region or old ones being reinforced? What are the moving dynamics of regional shifts in the region? And lastly, last but not least, how do these regional changes affect US policy and engagement with the broader Middle East and North Africa region? With the incoming Biden administration in a week, what kinds of changes should we expect toward the region? How do the regional changes affect US interests in the region? We have three distinguished panelists with us today in Stephen Cook, Michelle Dunn, and Peter Mandeville. Let me introduce them very briefly, and then we'll continue with the presentation. Stephen Cook is Eni Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow for the Middle East and Africa Studies and Director of International Affairs Fellowship for Tenured International Relations Scholars at the Council of Foreign Relations. He is an expert on Arab and Turkish politics as well as US Middle East policy. Stephen Cook is the author of False Dawn, Protest, Democracy, and Violence in the New Middle East, The Struggle for Egypt, from Nasser to Tahrir Square, Ruling but Not Governing, the Military and Political Development in Egypt, Algeria, and Turkey. And his forthcoming book, The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East, is being published with the Oxford University Press in 2022. Michelle Dunn is the director and a senior fellow in Carnegie Endowment's Middle East program, where her research focuses on political and economic change in Arab countries, particularly Egypt, as well as US policy in the Middle East. She was the founding director of the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East at the Atlantic Council from 2011 to 2013, and was a senior associate and editor of the Arab Reform Bulletin at the Carnegie Endowment. Michelle was a Middle East specialist at the US Department of State between 1986 and 2003, where her assignments included the National Security Council, the Secretary's Policy Planning Staff, the US Embassy in Cairo, the US Consulate General in Jerusalem, and the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. She also served as a visiting professor of Arabic language and Arab studies at Georgetown between 2003 and 2006. And Peter Mandeville, he's a professor of government politics at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He's also a non-resident senior fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution and senior research fellow at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. From 2015 to 2016, he was a senior advisor in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs at the U.S. State Department. Previous government experience includes serving as a member of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's policy planning staff between 2011 and 12, where he helped shape the U.S. response to the Arab Spring. At Mason, he was previously the founding director of the Center for Global Studies and also the director of the Ali Vural Ak Center for Global Islamic Studies. His previous visiting affiliations include American University Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Pew Research Center. He is the author of Transnational Muslim Politics, Reimagining the Ummah, and Politics from Afar, Transnational Diasporas and Networks. Thank you very much. We're gonna get started with Stephen. Stephen.
Great, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. Many thanks to Kadir and Kelsey for the kind invitation. And let me just say, it's always fun and interesting to share the virtual dais with my friends and colleagues, Michelle Dunn and Peter Manville. My specific task here today is to talk about authoritarian systems in the region after the Arab uprisings and how the Arab uprisings shaped these authoritarian systems. Let me start out by making a few claims and observations first. One, no one should be surprised by the outcomes that we've observed in the region. That's because, two, social revolutions are rare, and what transpired in the Arab world a decade ago does not necessarily qualify as social revolutions. 2B, transitions to democracy fail more often than they succeed. And then my third observation is, and I think this is important and most germane to the remainder of my remarks, is that the defenders of regimes throughout the region have differing views on a wide range of issues. But if there is one thing that they agree on, it's that the events of 2011 were an aberration and should never be repeated again. This is, as I said, this is my launch point. But before I move forward, I just want to clarify a couple of things in case I'm not clear in the rest of my remarks. First, I'm not arguing, I've never argued that people in the Middle East do not want democracy or that democracy in the region is impossible. I am saying that for a variety of reasons, the uprisings in 2011 failed, but that doesn't mean that failure is inevitable should there be another round of popular uprisings in the region. But the question that we have to ask ourselves, besides why did these uprisings fail, what were the effects? And that's my job here today. What were the effects on the authoritarian system? The uprisings taught regime defenders, whoever they are, colonels, princes, generals, prime ministers, whomever, that prevailing political orders and whatever tactics that they had used to ensure those prevailing political orders actually did not work. The stability that they had sought, that they had believed that they had succeeded in bringing, was no stability at all. But rather than seeking demands to accommodate demands for bread, freedom, and social justice, these defenders of the regime sought to re-engineer political institutions of the state to ensure that popular protests cannot threaten the status quo again. The result are systems that are fiercer, for lack of a better term, less tolerant of dissent, and importantly, well-equipped to prevent the quote-unquote aberration of 2011 from repeating itself. There is a combination of tactics that these regimes have used. There's old ways of doing things, mass arrests, the use of informants, pressure on the press. These were effective, but in many ways they were reactive. I think anybody who did dissertation research in the Middle East understood that their informants were, that their interlocutors were informing on them. But this was light surveillance of society, and that regimes and their defenders acted in generally reactive kind of ways. Since the Arab uprisings, there's real sense that regime supporters, regime defenders have gone on the offensive and availed themselves to a variety of resources that help make it possible for them to more thoroughly repress dissent. First is, I think, quite obvious, and I think something that has been reported in the press rather often, is technology. Surveillance has been used in ways in the Middle East in ways that they haven't been used before. They have availed themselves of new technologies that have made it possible to monitor larger portions of society. They're far more adept at this than they were just 10 years ago. And they've also become far more adept at misinformation across the region. It is startling to me to think about how far internal security services have come in the use of social media between 2010, 2011, 2012, and where they are now in terms of pushing out misinformation that either creates an environment of that creates support for the regime, or the idea that there is tremendous support for regimes, or they have unleashed this misinformation to undermine their opponents or would-be opponents. Second important way in which authoritarian regimes have been reshaped and continue to reshape and to be more thoroughgoing in their repression and dissent is international support for it. The outgoing administration, quite obviously, was not interested in issues related to political reform and change. In fact, quite the opposite. President Trump referred to Abdel Fattah Sisi as his favorite dictator, suggested ways in which Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman could cover up the Jamal Khashoggi murder more effectively, and remained silent on the kinds of repression, waves of repression that Turks have been experiencing. Europe, which people in the Middle East had also often looked at as an alternative to the United States to be better on the issues of human rights and freedom, has also determined that an era of political change is not only just over, but not likely, and have closed ranks with regional dictators for both reasons having to do with the wave of refugees going back to in 2015, as well as geostrategic interests. Third resource available to regional authoritarians, and the way in which they've and that has been helpful to them in reshaping authoritarian systems, is actually domestic political support. We don't know. This is something that's very hard to get at. We don't know the extent of support for leaders in the region. Polls, quite obviously, can't be trusted. They can't even be trusted here in the United States. It's hard to imagine how trustworthy they are when people in the region are being polled. But it's reasonable to believe that while the kinds of support that leaders want people to believe they have is not quite as large, it's still reasonable to believe that there are reservoirs of public support for these leaders in the region. I'm struck by the fact that leaders can go about doing the kinds of things that they are doing, and that millions of people in the region are either willing to go along with it or have just been depoliticized to the point where they accept what is happening. That is a form of support, and it is a way in which, and it is something which leaders in the region have taken advantage of in order to reshape, and as I said, reshape their authoritarian systems in ways that make them fiercer. And then I think the fourth resource available to regional authoritarians is something that I've touched on. It's the media creating narratives that are different from objective reality. This is not a phenomenon that's obviously given events in the United States, not just in the past week, but in recent years. This is a phenomenon that is not limited to the Middle East, but it is something that media in these countries have been harnessed to the advantage of these regional leaders that have advanced the repressive apparatus of the state. Now, I think the cases here are quite obvious. I won't go into too much detail into them, but just to highlight, I think the three most important ones, and we can discuss them further in Q&A. The first one, I think the paradigmatic case is, of course, Egypt. The coup d'etat that brought Sisi to power didn't necessarily change the regime. The political institutions and the interlocking social order remain. But in the words of my friend and colleague Steve Heidemann, the officers upgraded Egypt's authoritarian system, and it has become a system that has at least been more efficient in penetrating society and sweeping up people who are threats or more ominously perceived as threats. The Egyptian system was once one, as I alluded to before, was more reactive. Hosni Mubarak, I think, saw Egypt as a place to be managed, not a place to be resolved. And I think that is a quite different outlook from the current crop of leaders who want to use a variety of methods in order to ensure the security of the regime. And those resources that I outlined before, I think, are extraordinarily important to them in advancing their own narrative about Egypt's future and how to get there. The second case is Saudi Arabia. Much of the changes in Saudi Arabia have coincided with the rise of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his desire to rule the country more like his grandfather than his uncles. But undoubtedly, the Arab uprisings contributed to the transformation of Saudi Arabia into a police and surveillance state that reflects the kinds of police and surveillance states that we see in other parts of the region. Saudi Arabia has always been an absolute monarchy, but with many constituencies that required negotiation and consensus building and a significant amount of balance. That's no longer the case. Saudi Arabia obviously retains unique features, but as I said, its political system looks more and more like a typical authoritarian system, whether you find it in the region or in other places. And Mohammed bin Salman and his advisors have been shrewd in using technology, international support, building a reservoir of domestic support, and creating narratives that advance not just his parochial political interests, but advance the deepening of this surveillance police state, a trajectory change for Saudi Arabia. And the third case, I can't talk about these issues without looking at Turkey, a non-Arab case. The question that Kadir has posed to me is what changes on systems have the Arab uprisings had? And I think that's not to criticize Kadir, but I think we need to look at what Turkey's own uprising has done to Turkey's political system. And that, of course, is the Gezi Park protests, which were not just confined to Gezi Park, a small park adjacent to Taksim Square in central Istanbul, but they were actually nationwide. By the time that they happened in 2013, Turkey had already begun sliding back into authoritarianism. But those protests produced a kind of new old authoritarianism based on a charismatic leader and a ruling party. It's hard not to look at Turkey and either draw parallels to the early period of the Republic or kind of Weberian sultanism. It may, in this way, it's kind of historically rooted. But again, Turkish leaders have used all of the tools I articulated in order to innovate Turkey's authoritarian system. Now, finally, and I'll wrap up very quickly here, is the big question, and I think the big question that people ask themselves everywhere who look at these issues, it's kind of a tick in Washington. Are these systems more stable, more secure than those that came before them? Well, I guess an argument can be made that they are, because of the way in which they have been able to penetrate societies, create narratives that are in contrast to objective reality, but that nevertheless millions and millions of people believe in. But I would say that they're not necessarily more stable or more secure, because I think the balance of heroic vision, the ability to bribe constituencies, and coercion, three things that are, I think, critical to the success and durability of leaders, is off kilter. When you rely on coercion almost exclusively, it is expensive and it's dangerous for leaders. Still, I wouldn't go so far as to predict that these countries are unstable or stable. I think we have to look at them along a continuum of instability. Thanks. I'll stop here.
Michelle?
Hello, everyone. Please forgive me for being a bit late. I don't know if Kadir mentioned I'm in the midst of handling a pandemic-related crisis, but I'm really happy to be with you here today and talking about something else. I believe Kadir wanted me to speak about how the Arab Spring had affected U.S. policies in the Middle East and where do we expect the Biden administration to go. Now, we know that the Biden administration is going to approach this region in a pretty different way from the Trump administration. But to me, the question a little bit is how much will the Biden administration replicate the Obama administration approach to this region and to the issues surrounding the Arab Spring, and how much will it be different? So I was just thinking about this in terms of what's similar. What's similar, I think, about the Biden approach to the Obama approach and the situation in the region now compared to when Obama was in office, and what's different. So I'll tell you, here's what I think is similar. So I think many of the people who will go into the Biden administration, who we see going in already, have a kind of similar thinking to people from the Obama administration. I think they have a desire to show principled American leadership in foreign policy, as opposed to what I would say is sort of more the individual deal-making approach of the Trump administration. I think there will be more of a kind of normal national security decision-making process that balances various U.S. interests and so forth, as opposed to the Trump approach, which was quite unpredictable and which also was, willing to sacrifice a lot of interests that historically the United States had valued, or considerations, things that the United States had taken into consideration. And I also think the Biden administration, like the Obama administration, will have a predisposition to work multilaterally, including in the Middle East, to work with allies, to work with international organizations within the UN system, et cetera, all of which, of course, we know President Trump hasn't done. I also think in another way, there's the Biden administration will come in with, in some ways, a similar approach, actually, of the last several administrations, not only Trump, but also Obama, and even at the beginning, the George W. Bush administration, which is wanting to reduce the U.S. investment in the Middle East region while protecting key American interests. And I think the Biden administration is going to face a really important question, which is how to do this and how to diminish the American military presence in the Middle East without sacrificing key interests. And one of the big questions that will be on the table is, does that mean we arm our allies to the teeth? Does that mean we pour a lot of arms into the region? We see this very large arms sale to the UAE being pushed forward by the Trump administration, for example. And I also think the Biden administration, like the Obama administration, is going to come in wanting to, reach some sort of an agreement with Iran on its nuclear program in particular, and knowing that the new administration is probably going to have some tension with its allies in the region, with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with Turkey, related to Iran, as well as other issues. Now, what's also similar, oddly, is that President Biden is coming into office in the midst of a major domestic, American, and international crisis.
You're right.
And of course, I would say what's going on now between the pandemic and then the American political crisis related to the insurrection last week and so forth it's even worse, I think, than the financial crisis that Obama faced, although that seemed pretty big at the time when Obama came into office, right? And these major crises, really make it difficult for the United States to focus on foreign policy and, restoring American leadership, which is how I think the Biden people see themselves in a way, and the Obama people saw themselves that way too. There's another similarity I want to mention in terms of the situation in the Middle East now compared to when Obama came in 2009, which is that I think Biden's going to face a lot of turmoil in this region. You just heard Stephen Cook talking about the fact that although some of the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East are very coercive, they may not be very stable. I think that the pandemic pressed the pause button on protest in many places around the world, including for the most part in the Middle East, but that this whole enormous wave of change of the Arab Spring is by no means over. And that I think there will be a renewal of protest, of turmoil, very difficult to predict in exactly which countries, but I think it will happen during the 4 years of the Biden term. And I don't think the Biden administration people expect this any more than the Obama administration people did. The Obama administration came in not expecting the Arab Spring at all, right? And then being surprised by it. I could see that happening again with Biden, right? So now let me talk about a little bit what I think is different between the situation now and the Biden administration as opposed to Obama. Now, whenever there's a change of party in the White House, as we know, there's a tendency for the new administration to want to do exactly the opposite. Everything that the predecessor did was wrong. And that will be the case now, even more so maybe than in past turnovers of the White House. However, the way I think, if we look at the specific issues related to the Arab Spring, if we look at issues of democracy and human rights and so forth, the way the Biden administration are coming in and positioning themselves is very different from the Obama administration. If you recall, the Obama administration came in a way thinking George W. Bush had pushed too hard on those issues. And yes, although Obama made a nice speech in 2009, those issues were a little bit on the back burner. Now, I think the Biden administration comes in thinking, no, those issues do have to be out in front. And they've talked about it a lot. They believe, President Trump completely abandoned those issues, at least in the Middle East. And so they see themselves as bringing values back, ending what one of my colleagues at Carnegie calls the values holiday, ending that and bringing values back into foreign policy. And, people are talking a lot about how what we're going through in the United States right now, really tarnishing the reputation of the United States, the ability of the United States to speak about democracy internationally. I'm not sure that's how people in the Biden administration will see it. And in fact, I think they will want to have those values as part of the policies, not all of it, but part of the policies in the Middle East, even more so because of the challenges to democracy that we are handling inside the United States. The last thing I want to say is there is something about the situation in the Middle East that I think is very different now compared to 2009, or even indeed compared to 2016 when President Trump took office, which is that there's a big change going on, which is the looming end of the oil and gas era in the Middle East. And oil and gas wealth, of course, it's not over, but we can see the sunset now. We can see that, of course, there's a glut of global supply of oil and gas, and therefore what the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East rely on is of an asset of declining value. And of course, we can see that global demand for these resources is going to peak and start to decline. Already you can see signs of this. I don't want to go into details, but I see many signs that the regimes in the region, particularly in the Gulf, see that their wealth and their importance in the world has already started to decline and will continue to decline. And they're reacting to that in many ways. And so there's a very, very big change underway in the whole political economy of this region that, and I don't think that was the case, back when Obama came in and so forth, their oil prices were high, and there was a sense that some of the governments had a great deal of wealth to buy social peace internally and to spread around to control. I mean, Stephen just mentioned the 2013 coup in Egypt, for which the Gulf governments gave Sisi $20 billion. So, but I'm not sure that type of thing is going to be possible again. We're going to see a real reshuffling of power and regional alliances. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think it's going to be unfolding. It's going to start unfolding during this Biden administration. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Peter?
Great, thank you very much, Kadir, and greetings, everyone. I'm grateful to you and Kelsey for the invitation to be part of this discussion. It's always, as Stephen said, it's always wonderful to share a panel with my good friends and colleagues, Michelle and Stephen. So in my remarks, which I'll keep fairly brief to maximize the amount of time we have for discussion together, in my remarks, I want to talk a little bit about the question of Islamism as a political force in the Middle East, and how we should think about that in relation to questions about shifting modalities of authoritarianism, new regional dynamics, and the question of how the incoming Biden administration might approach its own policy of engagement towards Islamist movements. And I'll just clarify at the outset that when referring to Islamists, I'm primarily referring to the phenomenon that we might call electoral Islamism or mainstream Islamism. I'm not talking about, for example, primarily Salafi jihadi groups such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but rather groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Ennahda in Tunisia, those Islamists who have chosen to participate within the formal political system, and more specifically to offer themselves as a choice among others to electorates in the region. Now, I think that the conventional narrative around Islamism during and in the immediate aftermath of the Arab uprisings was the idea that we saw a kind of phenomenal ascent in their political fortunes, followed fairly shortly thereafter by an equally dramatic crash. That we've seen this sort of upswing and downswing. Obviously, Islamists were some of the earliest beneficiaries of regime changes and transitions in the region, appearing to be the segment of the political spectrum in the region that was best able to take advantage of changing political opportunity structures afforded by, for example, the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia. Although we should also remember that in Libya, for example, up to 2013, the reemergence of the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood and its role as a fairly dominant political force in that country for the first couple of years following the ouster of Muammar al-Gaddafi. So there's this idea that, Islamism rose and then fell dramatically and is now essentially a spent force, either, being removed through elections or a loss in popular support, as appeared to happen in Tunisia in 2013 and 2014, or of course, as we know all too well, in Egypt through a military coup in the summer of 2013. I want to suggest, however, that narrative of a rapid rise and equally rapid fall of Islamism is a little too simplistic, and that in fact, the present status and standing of Islamist groups around the region is far more complex than that. There are a number of countries where Islamists continue to function as important and in some cases significant political forces. I think, for example, of Morocco, where the Party of Justice and Democracy is still the party of government in that country. In Jordan, that country's last round of elections returned a faction of the Muslim Brotherhood as the single largest opposition bloc in its National Assembly. In recent elections in Kuwait, for example, the Islamists actually increased their share of seats in that country's assembly. And of course, we still have in Turkey an example of a government that has very strong Islamist inclinations and has been playing a very important role with respect to the regional dynamics around Islamism, more of which in a moment. So I think it's important to kind of start by recognizing that this narrative of a rapid rise and rapid decline of Islamists isn't quite accurate if we look at their current status and standing across the region. Now, Stephen, in his remarks, referred to our collective good friend Steve Heidemann's idea of an upgrading of authoritarianism. I like to think of it in terms of a metaphor from computing and technology, and the idea that the kind of operating system of authoritarianism in the Middle East has been both patched and upgraded, in the sense that the Arab uprisings revealed certain kinds of vulnerabilities that were then kind of patched in the same way that an operating system update might happen with your computer, as well as some new features and enhancements being added. I think one of the chief vulnerabilities identified by a number of regimes across the region was the idea that popular support for Islamist groups of the Muslim Brotherhood variety was indeed an existential threat to incumbent regimes. And so part of the enhancing and patching involved the introduction of fairly draconian new policies that sought to securitize, criminalize, and essentially negate political Islam as an effective social and political force across the region. I think the draconian crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood that we've seen in the aftermath of the 2013 coup in Egypt is the chief exemplar of this. We've reached a point now where arguably the Muslim Brotherhood is more oppressed than it's ever been, even under Hosni Mubarak in the late 1960s. And of course, that position that the Sisi government in Egypt has taken has been enthusiastically supported and in some ways shaped by the patronage and influence of the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, both of which have also realized the risks to their own monarchies potentially of growing popular support within their countries for Muslim Brotherhood style Islamism. And this is where I think where we link now to the kind of regional dynamics around Islamism and the idea and the need to recognize that at present, the question of support for or opposition to Islamism has become one of the defining aspects of a new geopolitical axis in the region, one that pits countries like Qatar and Turkey in their support for Islamism on the one side against countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and a couple of others such as Sudan that they've managed to pull along with them through a variety of incentives who are opposed to and make opposition to Islamism a defining feature of their broader conduct in the region. Now, looking ahead, however, my sense is that the situation is going to continue to be kind of complicated and fraught for a variety of regions. Not least of all because the examples that I cited at the beginning of my remarks about the relatively advantaged position that Islamists enjoy in certain countries is coupled with the fact that we know that in other countries, there are still fairly significant repositories or pockets of support for Islamists, including even in Egypt. And indeed, an early review of new data coming in from a project that Kadir and I, in fact, are working on together suggests that among the Egyptian population, we still find significant levels of support for Islamist social and political forces, even in the context of this intense securitization and crackdown on all forms of political Islam. Now, this is still a complicated future that Islamist groups face, not least of all because of the enhanced authoritarianism and security patches to the vulnerabilities that opened space for them to become more prominent. But I think also it's important to recognize that there are changes afoot with respect to what we might call the broader political sociology of Islamism in the Middle East. And this is the fact that while we might see people gravitating towards and expressing support in the abstract for a political project or ideology called Islamism, it's not entirely clear to me, and recent social science research would suggest to those who express support for such groups, what that actually means or what exactly it is they support. It used to be that in the 1980s and the 1990s, the groups that described themselves, that labeled themselves as Islamists, that understood themselves to be the chief exponents of the kind of modern Islamist movement, had a fairly clear agenda and a set of political positions that they organized around. Today, I think it's increasingly vague and diffuse. It's increasingly difficult to identify what an Islamist political agenda actually looks like. When you talk to, certainly in my own recent conversations with young political activists in the region, including some who continue to identify, in a sense, as Islamists, my impression is that they are gravitating towards Islamism not because it describes and names a clearly delineated alternative political agenda, but rather insofar as it functions as a symbol of something other than the prevailing authoritarian status quo. Amongst these young political activists, my sense is that people tend to trade less in expressions of affiliation and support for kind of conventional points on the political spectrum that we know of as liberalism or Islamism or secularism or leftism or solidarity with workers and labor movements, and to express their politics more dichotomously in terms of support for or opposition to regimes. And that's sort of the defining axis of political engagement in the region. So going forward, I think that one of the challenges that Islamists will face, despite some evidence that there is at least a nominal level evidence that they enjoy ongoing popular support, is the idea that their identity, their agenda, the very definition of what constitutes Islamism is, to my mind, increasingly vague. So that, you know, in addition to these structural constraints on their political engagement, I think it's fair to say that Islamism today is something of a crossroads in a more existential sense in terms of questions about what it actually means today to be an Islamist. One quick thing that I would flag in terms of places that we tend to not pay attention to with respect to the questions of mainstream political Islam, but where these groups may emerge as significant, are actually those countries that are hopefully in the process of emerging out of several years of civil war and conflict, namely Yemen, Syria, and Libya. three countries which, of course, have in them branches of the Muslim Brotherhood that have been fairly significant politically, and which I sense may be positioned to emerge as important political brokers in the context of any peace settlements that resolve those conflicts. Finally, just a word on US engagement with Islamist groups, which is something that I was involved in myself during my time at the Obama administration. My guess is that the Biden administration will be kind of first and foremost pragmatic in its orientation on this question. The Clinton administration, sorry, the Clinton State Department that I worked in was essentially forced to come to terms with and figure out how to do business with Islamists, because in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, they became the governments. And so it was important to be able to do business with them. I don't think that a Biden administration is likely to rush to refresh and reinvigorate a policy of engagement with Islamist parties. But as Michelle pointed out, if greater support for democracy and human rights is something that an incoming Obama administration is going to take seriously, then it is going to need to be able to engage, for example, with the Sisi government about the treatment that supporters and members of the Muslim Brotherhood have received in recent years. And I will leave things at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter, and all of our panelists. So I will ask all of our panelists to turn on their cameras and microphones, please. And we have some audience questions. I will direct them to each of you. If there are specific names that are attached to the questions, I'll direct them to you. But if not, feel free to jump in and answer the question. So the first question is, given that both Stephen and Michelle alluded to highly repressive authoritarian governments in the region not being necessarily stable, should Biden administration move away from the approach of previous US administrations, supporting leaders like Mubarak or Ben Ali, who ultimately fell? Should we adjust current US military aid to Sisi's Egypt, for example?
Michelle, you want to start? I'll pick up
Sure.
on it.
Yeah. Well, look, I think there's a lot that's broken in US relationships with some of these countries, and I would say Egypt is an example of that. I think that I do think the Biden administration will have a different approach toward Egypt than the Trump administration had, and that's not because the Biden administration is not going to want to do anything to destabilize Egypt, and is not going to want to just end the relationship or something like that. But I think that they're going to want to sort of maybe reestablish some US leverage in the relationship, which I think is still there. Egypt is highly dependent on outside help. For example, increasingly indebted to the IMF, very much needing help with its negotiations with Ethiopia over Nile water, and a number of other things. And still, still wants to have defense relationships with a lot of different countries, including the United States. I think that the Biden administration is, and probably is going to be looking a bit at these defense relationships. Now, there's a much bigger question, the one that I alluded to, that I think is going to affect all these defense relationships, which is, how does the United States diminish its military involvement? Does that mean pouring a lot of arms into this region? And that's going to have, that's going to kick off a new arms race, and it will affect the US relationships with every one of these allies, including Egypt. I mean, Egypt, for example, wanted the F-35 aircraft that UAE is now getting, and we're told no. They're not happy about that, and they bought Russian fighter aircraft instead, and now maybe sanctioned for it. So there's, it's a little difficult to predict how these relationships are going to go, but I don't think, honestly, President Trump behaved with Egypt as though he owed Sisi a favor, and he was paying it back all the time. He did a lot of special favors for Sisi. I just don't think President-elect Biden is going to be, behaving that way in this relationship.
Let me just quickly pick up on a couple of points that Michelle made, and the broader point that she ended on about overall U.S. relations with countries in this part of the world is that these relationships are really anachronisms. They are ones that are either really rooted in the Cold War, or they are rooted in what has guided U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, been the prime directive for U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for 67 years, which is the access to energy resources. And that's something that is increasingly less and less important in the United States. All about a global market. Clearly, American policymakers in the previous administration, in the Trump administration, and the incoming administration have serious questions about those policies that have had guided American foreign policy and our military posture in the region. This is a source of actual significant debate. In the Beltway, we've heard a lot about retrenchment. Again, Michelle alluded to it when she talked about, well, are we going to dump lots of weapons into the region? That is essentially what retrenchment means. It means the United States essentially withdrawing to a degree in the region and providing the means for our regional partners to stabilize the region. More often than not, that means dumping lots of weapons. And it makes me nervous that we're going to use that for a variety of reasons. Some germane to this conversation about resurgent authoritarianism, and some germane just to the idea that this is a region where people are going to be expected to use these kinds of weapons in a responsible way. The record so far suggests otherwise. When it comes to Egypt specifically, I think that again, the kind of old debate about pragmatism, security versus values is going to come up once again. And I honestly don't know how it's going to be resolved. At the very least, there's going to be a change of tone in the relationship. President Biden will not act as if he has something to owe President Sisi. And in fact, that's not just some line. I mean, there is some evidence of Egyptian interference in the 2016 election. So at the very least, and I think it would be beneficial for the United States to alter its tone, particularly given this profound wave of repression in Egypt. I remain somewhat skeptical that we will either use the leverage or that we have as much leverage as we think. In my pre-pandemic last visit to Egypt, the Egyptians, obviously sticking their chests out at me, were saying that the United States should not expect Egypt to choose between either the United States or China and Russia, because they weren't willing to make that choice. Again, certain amount of bravado there, but something that is different in the region now is that regional actors do believe that they have other options from the United States. And I think in the Egyptians' best of all worlds, they would pursue a kind of redux of positive neutralism where they extract as much as they can from different powers. But I do think it's going to be debate in the Biden administration, and I do think it's going to be uncomfortable for Egypt, which has coasted for 4 years and been able to basically pursue this wave of repression, feeling safe in that the United States was not going to protest, except for members of Congress. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions on Iran. One of the questions is asking, is this specter of Iran another enhancement of authoritarian regimes in the area? So I guess in a way, the question is, can we really disentangle the way authoritarian regimes have, boosted their sort of security measures against opposition and dissidents from what's happening in Iran? Any panelists?
Let me just quickly, I talked about it a little bit, about kind of the creation of narratives in these countries. In Egypt, you have a kind of recasting of the nationalist narrative that is in a way that supports the current order. I don't think we should be surprised by that. I think that the most profound place that the most profound change and the most interesting change has actually been in Saudi Arabia, where there has been this kind of wave of nationalism, and it has been justified in ways in the regional conflict with Iran. And I think that once you get down to the kind of this level, it is difficult, one, for there to be a kind of negotiation. I think the Biden people are going to find that it's going to be very, very difficult to, even though the Saudis are making right noises about it, to bring the Saudis into a negotiation in a way that is going to be successful. But I think that the idea that a nationalist narrative that justifies conflict, that is conflictual, and that doesn't allow for dissent is important. Questioning Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen, which is about Iran, is important. But it is also seen as a threat by the crown prince and the people around him. In a similar way, but not as kind of intense, questioning the blockade on Qatar was something that led to at least house arrest. So and remember, part of the justification for the blockade of Qatar had to do with Doha's relationship with Tehran. So again, having called out Saudi Arabia as being kind of one of the more interesting cases of a kind of reshaping of an authoritarian system, Iran and that external threat and the kind of wave of nationalism, the way nationalism has been used in Saudi Arabia in ways that it hadn't been before, I think is important to keep in mind as we look at politics in the region.
Thank you. Any others want to jump in the question? If not, so we're running out of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a couple of questions. Any of you can, give us your quick takes, and then we'll wrap it up. So there are a couple of questions on the Abraham Accords, and what the success of these accords going to be, how we can relate them to the Arab Spring, the fallout from the Arab Spring and its relation to Iran. If you can have a take on that. Another question that I have is, even though Tunisia is mentioned briefly by some of you, it's sort of the lone beacon of the Arab Spring protests. It's the only democracy that's emerged out of this, and it has a significant Islamist party presence in the government or in the parliament right now. So how do you envision the US policy toward Tunisia moving forward, especially for the Biden administration? In what ways do you think the US can support Tunisia to entrench democratic governance in Tunisia? And the last question is, some analysts have noted the important and vocal role women played in the Arab Spring. To what extent has the Arab Spring produced feminist outcomes 10 years on? Okay. 3 questions, quick takes, and we'll wrap it up.
So I'm happy to weigh in briefly on the Abraham Accords question that I noticed came up several times. I'm of the school of thought that does not see the Abraham Accords as an accomplishment of the Trump administration, simply insofar as I think Israel and the United Arab Emirates were hot to get together. And basically the Trump administration, I think, was a prop. They essentially used the Trump administration as a prop to help validate a rapprochement that had its own regional logic. So it's not that the Trump administration succeeded in bringing together 2 reluctant partners there. There's very good reasons why, in the context of a re-solidified anti-Iran alliance and in the context of several countries that felt threatened by the regional changes wrought by the Arab uprisings, that they would come closer together. So I think there are certain respects in which the existence of the Abraham Accords is actually going to be a challenge for the Biden administration. Insofar as it connects to Iran, again, I think Iran will be a challenge because, as my colleagues noted, the impulse will be to try to get Iran back into the nuclear deal. I think it will be impossible for the Biden administration, however, to do what the Obama administration tried to do, which was to make that deal very narrowly focused on the nuclear issue and to leave aside other aspects of Iran's regional conduct. So I think renewed engagement with Iran will have to involve some aspect of that. I think the question for the Biden administration will be, to what extent do you want to continue putting pressure on in an effort to weaken Tehran versus the extent to which containing Iran is likely to redound to the benefit of the administration's broader priorities. And I suspect that that latter approach will be more consistent with what the incoming administration wants to achieve in the Middle East more broadly.
May I say a word about Tunisia? Kadir, just so we're at the 10-year anniversary now, of the Tunisian Revolution, and Tunisia has been in a tough place and continues to be in a tough place. And what really has not happened is the emergence of an economic vision, a vision for economic transformation in the country to match the political vision. The Tunisian president now is talking about a new national dialogue, and maybe to get to that place, and maybe they can. I mean, they've been successful with the national dialogues before. What I would say about the United States here is, I hope a question that the incoming Biden administration will ask itself is not, where can we bring democracy or where can we make it happen? It's no, what can we do with allies to help to rebuild an enabling international environment for the emergence of democracy? So when you have a fledgling democracy like Tunisia, what can we all be doing? I don't think the Trump administration did any harm there. It didn't focus much on Tunisia at all, and but I think there is more that the United States and other democratic allies and international institutions can do to build this enabling environment. That was a real failure at the time of the first Arab Spring for the international community to enable transitions.
Let me just add 2 cents on the Abraham Accords. I apologize. I don't feel expert enough to answer the question on women in the Arab Spring, and I don't want to venture into an area where I don't feel comfortable. Just to highlight something that Peter said, it is clear that the Abraham Accords was something that the Emiratis and the Israelis cooked up on their own, and that the United States then paid for in the form of F-35s and other things to the Emiratis and additional F-35s to the Israelis. One of the unfortunate precedents of the Egypt-Israel peace treaty of 1979 is that anytime that there is some sort of diplomatic change positive between Israelis and an Arab country, the United States is expected to pay for it in terms of copious amounts of weapons. The only case that I can think of where that has not happened has been the Bahrainis. But another point, there is a strategic consensus between the Israelis and the Emiratis, but I don't necessarily think it is on Iran. It's on Turkey. Unnoticed by most people, at the time the Abraham Accords was being signed, Emirati air crews were practicing in the Eastern Mediterranean with the Hellenic Air Force and others. That's where there's a real strategic consensus between Israel and the Emiratis. Where there isn't as much, there is, but isn't as much, is on Iran. Because think about this. The Saudis and the Emiratis are focused on a new negotiation between the United States and Iran, and their primary interest is Iran's malevolent activity around the region. The Israelis are obviously worried about that, but their primary interest is Iran's nuclear program. Each one is willing to give up on the other. The Israelis want a narrow agreement, feeling confident that they can smack the Iranians around the region whenever they feel, whereas the Saudis and the Emiratis want a much broader agreement. In fact, the Emiratis and the Saudis at the time of the original JCPOA said, you know what? We'll buy the Iranians a nuclear device as long as they don't get sanction release. There is tension in that, which is going to make it even more difficult for the Biden administration to go after a JCPOA 2.0. So yeah, there's lots of love between Abu Dhabi and Jerusalem, and the Emiratis are showing up, and Israelis they're showing up in droves, and there's lots of nice things that are happening there. But there is a little bit of tension built into that relationship that I'm not sure can be contained as the Biden administration pursues something new with the Iranians.
Thank you, Peter, Stephen, and Michelle for all your comments. With this, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you very much to our panelists for being here, especially to Michelle at a difficult time in her family. And to all the audience members, thank you for listening to us. I'm guessing we're going to upload the video of this on YouTube on our Baker Institute channel, so feel free to pass it on to your loved ones. Thank you, and have a good day.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks.